This is Duke University.
Welcome. My name is Lou Brown. I'm the Director of Programs at the Forum for Scholars and Publics at Duke University. Tonight, we're delighted to host this conversation between Leslie Jamison and Lauren Henschel. So tonight's discussion builds on a program we hosted at the Forum for Scholars and Publics a little over 5 years ago. That discussion, which also included Duke Professor Jahan Geeth, was made possible through the hard work and creative thinking of Michaela Dwyer and Duncan Merle. And I definitely want to thank them again tonight for having sown the seeds that brought us back together. Leslie Jamison is the author of 3 nonfiction books: The Empathy Exams, Make It Scream, Make It Burn, and The Recovering: Intoxication and Its Aftermath, as well as a novel, The Gin Closet. She's a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine and teaches in the graduate nonfiction program at Columbia University. In her writing, Leslie Jamison embraces the simultaneity of absence and presence, presses us to let an ache be an ache, to resist the temptation to turn each pain into a morality tale. But she also celebrates beauty and pleasure, and especially the human body in all its perfect imperfection. Her writing grows out of an attentiveness to the big stories to be found in the littlest of details, and her remarkable ability to see what lies in the spaces and the silences amidst all the noise and bustle of modern life. She has described her own work as an ongoing fascination with the grace of ordinariness, an increasingly insistent belief in unextraordinary lives as sites of meaning. Maybe what I appreciate most about her writing, most in these days of alone together, as we say, is the ways her writing sparks my own attentiveness and sense of aliveness, not just to the immediate world around me, but to the memories of things I've read or witnessed or experienced in the past, and the ways those past me's are continually being remixed. She invites conversation with all our past selves, as well as with her, like she's always lurking there in the margins, waiting to engage. I repeatedly find myself, when reading her essays, wanting to send her a note and say, hey, did you see this other exhibit? Or I wonder if you've read, your writing reminded me. She says of Gary Winograd photographs in her recent essays for The Atlantic, I didn't think he was making the world more beautiful. I thought he was excavating beauty that was already there. I think the same could be said of Leslie Jamison's writing. And I want to share, I'm going to try sharing my screen now to show you an image from Gary Winograd's work. So this is one of the images that she writes about. Lauren Henschel is a visual artist working primarily in 16mm film and installation. Her work interrogates questions around guilt, illness, disability, shame, and mortality, and seeks to defy or alter an audience's expectations of what art can reveal about the experience of inhabiting a body. She graduated from the Master of Fine Arts in Experimental and Documentary Arts program at Duke University in 2020, where she's currently an adjunct professor. Lauren's emergence as an artist began when she was in high school, as she found herself having to retreat from her previous passion for sports. Diagnosed with psoriatic arthritis, an inherited condition, she had to learn to cope with sometimes excruciating pain while also developing a different narrative for her life. If not a teenager with hopes of becoming a college athlete, what was she? What did it mean to inhabit this body? Over the next several years, this question led her to photograph the scars marking the bodies of people from all over the country, many of whom sought her out when they learned about her project. Along with the photographs, she collected audio stories, discovering that people really wanted their stories to be told. They longed to be seen. Since her early work on scars, Lauren has recently completed her MFA, as I said. Her latest project, Fibers of Being, extends her exploration of pain, but turns the camera more inward at her own story and that of her father. Her work raises questions about what it means for deep love to be mixed with sometimes unbearable guilt, for growth and hope to be forever mingled with decomposition and fear. When she talks about the more vulnerable, risk-taking turn her work has taken over the past few years, she points to her first encounter with Leslie Jamison's writing in The Empathy Exams and the opportunity they had to talk about art and empathy and invisible pain back in 2015. We're honored to be able to share in their conversation tonight as they revisit some of the themes they first discussed 5 years ago, made more palpable during our current crisis.
No matter where we went, everyone knew I was your kid. There was just this unmistakable, resemblance between us that was almost so much that when I started to realize what the disease was, there was just a part of me that always knew that I would get it, and it lived in me.
Okay, so off to you two.
Well, first of all, amazing to see that. I'm glad. So many things are strange and hard about this era, but it's kind of miraculous when we stumble into these moments where something feels like it's become possible. And I feel like actually just those last 3 minutes of being in this Zoom room of whatever, 140 people all experiencing your work in that way is really powerful. And hopefully when we speak, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about the different elements of your installation and the installation we just saw and how they fit together. But I thought before I respond a little bit to what we just saw, I would just say a few words about the conversation that Lou mentioned that you and I were able to have with Jehan 5 years ago, and that this conversation is building on, which is something I've never quite done before. Continued a conversation in this way after we've been making our art kind of in relation to that when it's really wonderful. But I remember being so awestruck when I came to Duke by your work. I was able to experience the SCAR project that Lou was describing, and I was so struck by the ways that the form of that art seemed to be saying to me something very profound about pain, which is the constant obstacles that are always present in the encounter with another person's pain. How we can look at a scar and there's so much we don't know about what that pain feels like, about even where that pain came from. And the way that you added people's voices sort of telling the stories of their scars was both a gesture towards completion. Okay, now I know something more about where this scar comes from, but also a kind of continuation of that feeling of like, yeah, you can see the scar and you can know the story, but like we're coming right up against that edge of possibility. Like, how can we ever we probably can't ever really get inside that experience of pain. And my work was obviously thinking about that question in certain ways too. And I think that's part of why we felt this kind of soul kinship with each other. But I was struck then, and I'm struck now by this new installation, by the kind of the ways in which, even as your work is sort of gesturing at some of those gaps or some of those limits, it's so immersive and also offering a kind of almost a trance-like experience of pain, of communion, the ways that we hear you and your father speaking to each other, the ways we see the mushrooms growing from the walls, the ways we get very close to the process of the injection itself. There's so much intimacy there, even as we're also being sort of asked to reckon with how much we can know. And there's so much to say and so much to ask, but as we were going back and forth a little bit, thinking about each other's work and this event, we were talking some about a quote from the Randall Jarrell poem, 90 North, that I just wanted to read for everybody who's here, maybe as a way to set the stage for some of what we're going to talk about the ways in which art comes from pain, but also the sort of seductive myth that all pain can be made into art or can be turned into something beautiful. So some people here might already know this poem, might already love this poem, but I'm just going to read from the end of it. This is, again, Randall Jarrell's 90 North. I'll put that in the chat once I'm done, but it closes with these lines. I see at last that all knowledge I wrung from the darkness, that the darkness flung me, is worthless as ignorance. Nothing comes from nothing. The darkness from the darkness. Pain comes from the darkness, and we call it wisdom. It is pain. And certainly one of the things that I would love to hear you speak about when we talk, and maybe speak about in relation to this current installation, is that dilemma of how pain can become something beautiful, what you think about when you make art in terms of making pain something beautiful, but also the the limits of that alchemy, or when and how you come up against that sense that like this pain is actually just pain. So I'm so glad to be here with you and to get the chance to talk about your work.
Yeah, I just wanted to just briefly like touch on the 2015 conversation, which I think I had coffee with Lou. I think everything shut down a day later because of COVID, and I just said, how it's been, I think it's been 5 years since I last saw you, Lou, and I think it's been 5 years since Leslie and I had this conversation. How amazing would it be for us to be able to reconnect? I think mostly just because I've carried your work with me in the deepest of ways through my past 5 years, and I maybe just wanted to share a little bit about the impact that your work has had on me, and then we can jump into these questions. And yeah, but I think like my friends who were around could attest. I was a senior in college when we had that first conversation, and I like couldn't move for like 3 days after we spoke. Like people would bring me like chicken nuggets and stuff, and I just kind of was collapsed into this jean couch we had in our apartment. And I think because something inside of me broke open, that you talked about my work as being on the border of this pain that we can confront, but also maybe we can't. Like it's just this like fine line of where we can understand and then also we don't understand at all, and maybe it's the reckoning of not understanding that's in this moment. And for me, I had that moment in talking to you about my work where I was just like, hold on, have I been doing this with myself? Like have I been in making this work, have I been pushing off dealing with myself, like reckoning with my own pain? And I think it didn't feel like that true to make work for a while after that, just because I was thinking a lot and because I didn't know if I could talk about my own story. And I was living in New York and working, and decided I'm going to apply to an MFA program because, the only thing really left to do is either explore my art or I have to quit or just like leave. And I knew that if I went to an MFA program, I was going to have to explore my own self. And by exploring myself, I was going to have to explore my own illness and explore my relationship with my dad, which I think, my dad is so wonderful. I just told you that he spent like 3 hours calling everyone, trying to get them in here. But genetic trauma and genetics, and you kind of so wonderfully, I will get back to this, but you talk about the vector's guilt. That resonated just like so deeply with me in this moment. But yeah, I don't know. I applied to the MFA program, and I just started digging into my like own self as hard and fast as I could, because I just knew that was the only thing I could do. And what started coming up was just this like these ideas of mortality and of fragility and of like my own mortality, and this moment of being both like alive and dead at the same time, and like confronting illness, confronting shame, confronting guilt, and just like going deep digging and going deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. And there's just nowhere, you can't come up. Like you just have to keep digging. And I felt that way when I first read the empathy exams. Like there was just this digging and digging and digging, and this knowing, or this kind of like beginning to know myself and the limits, and the also just like this ability to understand and think about my own pain that I never thought I was capable of. And I think like I'm here because of that conversation. I'm I made this work because your work pushed me in that way, and I'm just forever grateful for that. So.
Oh, well, thank you. It means the world to me to hear that. And I mean, it's powerful to hear you talk about the intimacy with your father as part of this work, and the kind of that sense of digging and digging and digging as part of the making of the work. And I'm wondering, maybe before we get even more into some of these questions about pain and beauty and shame and the personal and looking inward and looking outward, I wonder if you could just talk us through a little bit of what we saw in that video, what this installation you made consists of. Tell us about the videos. Tell us about the conversation we're hearing between you and your father. Tell us about, I'm obsessed with the mushrooms, so I'm going to make you tell us about the mushrooms.
Yeah. Well, I hit a point like about a year ago where I called my dad and I was just like, hey, Dad, are you willing to go down this path with me? Because I was trying to make work about myself, but every time I tried to make work about myself, I would bring up my dad, but I would say that I was too scared to explore it. I think in preservation of him, of me, of all people who are, vectors, like that was that quote, and I'll read that quote, but you talk about it in relation to COVID, but I think it's so true of just humans. Like we pass on these things that are like good and bad and ugly, and you talk so much about your daughter and your work, and it just really like hit home and struck me. My dad, this illness that I have is genetic. I about a month and a half ago was diagnosed with a second thing that my dad also has. So we're double autoimmune twins. But my dad talks at the end of that video about how maybe he's still dealing with it himself, and that's why he couldn't help me deal with it. And it's just like, I think for so long I was looking to my dad as the person who had these answers for why I was in pain, and I couldn't see him as a person, and instead was just seeing him as this like vector of information or of whatever it was, but he was the source, whether good or bad. I looked to him for the answer, and he didn't have that. And so that I think for both of us, we started just burying this part of our relationship that we just thought we couldn't repair or confront. And so this piece, every time I tried to explore my own illness, my dad came up in every conversation, and I was just like, all right, well, for better or for worse, like this is happening. And I started through having conversations with my dad on the phone, which is, I think, the core of this piece. So what you saw is 3 minutes of an installation that you could probably explore for like over an hour. But it's this conversation with my dad that happens on the outskirts of the room. So you're not really like watching film or existing in this space. You're just hearing. You're just listening to this conversation between a father and a daughter unfold. Nothing extraordinary. I mean, I'm tying your work in already, but finding this communication or this understanding in just this ordinary unfolding of a conversation between a parent and a child. And then as you move in closer, you see these two projected images on the outside of the structure, both in 16 millimeter film because I really started thinking about film as body, as this body living in parallel to my body that I could do things to, that I could alter in the same ways that my body has been altered by medication or by fluids or by whatever exists in the world. And so like I did alter the film with my medication, and that's what you see, the ripping at the inside of my interior is the medication that I'm injecting myself with has then affected the body of the film. And on the flip side of the building is this kind of like alien landscape exploration of my father's skin. And then at the center of the room is the mushroom womb, or I don't know what we've come up with so many names for it, but it's the space of internal reflection. There's not, that audio that you're hearing is not existing in that space. It's for people to come to it, to come to the center of this space, the center of, I guess, meaning or of
of the body, or of, I don't know what, but the space that's both living and dying at the same time. That's in full decay while also fruiting. And isn't that just like really what we're all kind of doing? And so
yeah, well, I was
about the mushrooms, but I'm gonna stop now.
no, but it's all it's I didn't mean to sometimes I interrupt from excitement, but it was when you were talking about mushrooms as sort of enacting in their very existence this idea of fruiting from decay, that's actually, you know, for a mushroom, for your mushrooms, it's not an abstraction, but a concrete fact. And I actually hadn't known that until talking to you a bit about your art, that the sort of form of the mushroom is what the system produces as a response to what it detects or understands as threat. And that was so moving to me, that your installation would be filled with the fruits of what comes when a system detects a threat to itself or to its body. Because, you know, in so many ways we can understand the artwork you're making about your own body and your own pain as a kind of a fruit emerging from damage, but also the art that you're making and the ways you're extending yourself towards other people's pain, the work that you're making about scars, the ways that you're soliciting other people's stories. Like, that's yet another fruit coming from the system under threat, right? That it's like partially through the experience of your own body as something precarious, something in pain, something that has sort of become visible through the ways in which it's compromised, or through the ways in which you're constantly having to engage or intervene with it. That the art, the awareness of and curiosity about what that process might look like for others is a sort of another mushroom blooming from threat. So it makes sense to me that the mushrooms are literally, physically at the core of it all. And I wonder, I mean, I have a ton of questions to ask about the ordinary, and I'm glad that you already brought it up in terms of thinking about how much meaning can we find in, you know, an ordinary conversation between a father and a daughter. And I love the ways that the conversation that we hear preserves the sort of awkwardness and stuttering and moments of, you know, who's going to speak. All of that is so human, and that the texture is so faithful to what it's actually like to be in communication with another person. You're trying to figure out the landscape as you go. But also even the ordinariness of making a film of the process of injecting yourself with medication, that it's this ordinary act, it's this ritual act, it's a pattern. It might seem like the least extraordinary thing to make art from, but I think we're both quite interested in how the unextraordinary, what it holds. So maybe we could talk a little bit about that. How did you always know that these sort of ordinary moments, or something as small as the act of injection, was part of what you wanted to document about this experience of pain? Or did it take you, was it a sort of process to arrive at something humble in that way, as being so core to the installation?
Yeah, I think, can I read one of the quotes from one of your essays, and then we could keep going?
Yeah.
Okay. So you wrote, these were stunning scenes, not because they were extraordinary, but because they weren't. They were full of ordinary people, seen so clearly that they became extraordinary in their beauty. How do you make a photograph that's more beautiful than what was photographed? Winograd once asked. But I didn't see his photos that way. I didn't think he was making the world more beautiful. I thought he was excavating beauty that was already there. His alchemy didn't turn the world holy so much as it revealed that the world had been holy all along. Outside the doors of the museum, and inside them too, we were holy. That was part of the grace of his work, how it suggested that anyone could be art, that the people standing in that darkened room were no less radiant than the people glowing on the walls in front of them. I like was just like, I could, yeah, I mean, this whole, I mean, really, we're thinking about 4 essays, and I wish we could talk about them forever, but that really hit me. I think maybe I could talk a little bit about what you just asked, and then maybe we can talk a little bit about this experience that you had revisiting this exhibit, not only this one, but also the one of home movies, where you're kind of circling around these ideas of the ordinary and the extraordinary. But I just thought that tied so beautifully into the conversation that I didn't really want to stop. But so I don't know if this is an annoying answer. It might be. It might be like an annoying answer.
I'm already annoyed.
But I never was like really making aesthetic choices when I was making the work. I was more just trying to like, I think in the Scars work, I was making aesthetic choices. And I think that this installation did end up being aesthetic, but not because I like thought that that's how it would come together, but because I was just like, you know, sitting with my dad on my back porch being like, Lauren, you have 10 minutes to speak to your relationship right now with what's in front of you, and you're going to shoot this whole roll, and then that's it. It's what's in front of you. And then it ended up being aesthetic. Like the mushrooms ended up being aesthetic, but it really was just these like ordinary thoughts that I had, like walking through the hospital, coming across a Mary Oliver poem and thinking, oh wow, wouldn't it be crazy if this room was filled with she talks in this poem about like the rising and the falling in the night in nature, the rising and the falling of bodies and of nature. And wouldn't it be crazy if like maybe I could give people that feeling, and you know, I'm gonna film myself one take of this injection, and I'm gonna treat it with my medicine, and then maybe people will see what it's like. They were not thoughts that were like elaborate or that were trying to speak to something that I didn't think anyone else could speak to. They were just coming from this like place in me that was like longing to understand myself and my relationship with my dad, and to make visible something that I felt was not. And it's pretty basic. I don't know.
I love, there's so much in there. First of all, I love that idea. It's a wonderful way to articulate the experience of being inspired or influenced by art, which is, I think, an experience we often think of in terms of content or form. Like you engage with a work of art, you encounter a Mary Oliver poem, you go to an art installation, and it somehow inspires you in some directly concrete or content-oriented way. But there is this other way that inspiration and influence work that you described so eloquently, which is, this art made me feel a certain way, and how can I make art that might give other people that feeling? It's a much more corporeal, affective, experiential understanding of like, this way I felt in this moment, how could I create the experience for other people? And it might have nothing to do with the content or the form of the originating art, but you're somehow passing along the way that, like, I love the way the writer Lewis Hyde talks about art as a gift that the artist receives somehow from outside of himself or outside of herself, and that the job of the artist is to pass that gift along, to keep it in circulation. And it's like, when you encounter that Mary Oliver poem, you're keeping it in circulation by creating that experience, actually, or an experience for all of us, even in this Zoom room. And I also just wanted to highlight something you said, because I think it's kind of amazing, and I'm sure some people already know it about your work, but that you literally were using your own medication to physically treat the film, right? So that's part of what creates that visual distortion that we're seeing. And that idea of kind of art also as experiment, I think, is really powerful. Like, you know, you describe it as basic. I think that's right, in a way, basic in a wondrous way, like that art is a kind of a what if that we follow. What if I treat film with the same chemicals I put in my body? What then? And, you know, I can say a few words about the kind of offering a little bit of context on the quote you read about the Gary Winograd exhibition. So I was engaging in the fall and early winter with two different museum exhibitions that were up in New York, where I live. One was an exhibit of Gary Winograd's photographs, color photographs, at the Brooklyn Museum. And I'm going to quickly screen share one shot. So this is just a glimpse. I think we saw it briefly from Lou as well. This is what the Winograd exhibition looked like at the Brooklyn Museum, and it created what the passage that Lauren read suggests is kind of, to me at least, a kind of church feeling, where you have these snapshots of ordinary life projected on the walls, and you're immersed inside of them. And I was writing about that exhibition and honestly spending a lot of time there with my daughter. And then if we have a moment, I might just play something quickly from the other exhibition and talk about it. So the other exhibition that I was spending a lot of time with earlier this year, right before the pandemic, was MoMA in New York reopened after a major renovation. And one of the exhibitions that was part of their reopening was an exhibition of home movies, which I was thinking about a lot when I was encountering your work, both because some of what I found moving about the films was that they, some of them were by famous artists, Peggy Awesh, Andy Warhol, Cindy Sherman, Dali, I think, had a film. But a lot of them were just made by ordinary people. They were scenes from ordinary life. So it was, as opposed to the artist's name on the plaque, it was next to a movie. It was the surname of a family: the Thompson family, the Hughley family, the Jarrett family, and the I'm going to play just 30 seconds of the Jarrett family home movie. So this is from the Jarrett family home movie, and you can see you can see a couple things. You can see it seems to be like a kid's birthday party, but it's an ordinary evening, and you can see some of the effect on the film, almost like an algae creeping across it of the passage of time, and the ways in which it's working on the materials themselves, but also, I think, suggesting something about what happens to memory and what happens to youth, and how experience is sort of constantly receding further and further away from us. But part of what was strange about the arrival of the pandemic was that I had been spending a lot of time with these Winograd photographs and spending a lot of time with these home movies, both of whom were, their force came from the ways in which they were excavating the beauty of the ordinary, the beauty of the mundane, the beauty of the daily. And then pandemic forced all of us into very different but powerful experiences of the daily. We were all quarantined at home, and so it was almost like the universe or fate had I was sort of calling my bluff in some way. Like, it was like, oh, you find ordinary humdrum daily experience so profound and so meaningful. Well, how about you stay in a small apartment with your toddler for 2 weeks and think about that. And so then I, in quarantine, I was starting to do some writing about the experience of getting COVID and being ill and caring for my daughter, but really what it meant to have life become so fully and claustrophobically, but sometimes wondrously about the daily, which is not to sugarcoat the suffering that the pandemic has wrought, but to say that there's something powerful that I think we're all reckoning with in the dailiness of quarantine, that both of those installations were somehow prophesying before it happened. But I wonder to kind of think about that moment you were describing with Mary Oliver, and that feeling of, wouldn't it be amazing if I could create some kind of experience like that for other people? I'm curious what sorts of experiences you hope people will have with your art, or imagine them having with your art, and sort of how you imagine the different components that you were describing, that mushroom womb, the ordinariness that you transform into beauty. What kinds of experiences you imagine people having, and how you imagine the different parts sort of working together.
Well, I like wish we could talk forever, because I love what you were, the writing that you do about the archive and about just the ordinary, the home videos, that is, I'm teaching a class right now, I think some of my students are in here, but about the archive, about found footage, about, what our responsibility is as people who repurpose or rearticulate or engage with these ordinary pieces of work. And so, or the archive in general. So I just, it's amazing to me. But and your work and your writing about COVID is also just so, I don't know, there's this quote that I've been repeating in my head like over and over and over again for days now, but I just want to make sure we get it in there because I just need to say it. But you say, "I'm still up at night with the vector's guilt. Everyone who is sick is someone else's patient zero." There's something beautifully grotesque about that phrase, shedding virus, as if with a black light you could see the sloughed off skin, sickness like curling snakeskins all over my apartment, crumbling to dust. I just, and that's just so, it resonated with me so strongly, and I just, I would love to talk about it some more. I think we maybe, I don't know what time it is right now, but
I think we might even go a little over. But if, for those who want to stay and hang out and keep talking and asking questions, but it's interesting to me that phrase of the vector's guilt, which in that essay has a kind of a COVID meaning, where I think part of what's been powerful about COVID is that we're all understanding ourselves, I think, hopefully, we're being ethically responsible about the pandemic, not just as possible victims, but as possible vectors. Like, what do we owe the bodies of the people around us? And so much of what this installation is about, with especially the recording of the conversation with your father, is this sense of guilt at a kind of genetic inheritance that, of course, in a literal way isn't his fault and is something he's suffered under. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the process of involving him in making your art, and whether anything surprised you when you and he had the conversations that ended up becoming part of the installation, or whether there were things you felt you understood differently or thought about differently, sort of at the other side of that process, whether it came from the actual act of talking to him or whether it came from the act of trying to find meaning or make art from that conversation with him.
Yeah, so I think like that I think that quote stuck with me so much because it really reminded me of these conversations, this series of conversations that I had with my dad, and they were over the phone, and I remember flying to Miami like right before it was almost too late to go try and re-record the conversation so that it wasn't recorded through the phone, like to make it just like clearer some way. And every time we tried to have the conversation again, it wasn't the same. And so the conversation that you're hearing is the first time we ever have this conversation. And I'm just trying to kind of talk through and just be like, Dad, these are the kinds of things that we're going to talk about. But we end up kind of going off and having this conversation that we've needed to have for probably like 12 years, maybe longer. The whole installation kind of comes together around these a few moments in time, like one being just walking through the hospital one day in September, stopping in my tracks, looking up. There are just bodies moving all around me, trying to get somewhere, trying to get somewhere in the hospital, and just turning and seeing this poem. And then, just knowing that there has to be something organic, that they're, talking to people and saying like, what can I do here? Not even knowing that the mushrooms made sense until I was standing in a mushroom farm with poop all over my feet from like the farm, like not even really knowing that mushrooms can, like the connections, they would come from just this exploration, like just knowing that I had to like succumb to this journey that I was on, and that just constantly being reassured by people that, you know, if this sucks, it's just your MFA thesis, you know, like in January, I think I presented this in crit and everyone was just like, what are you doing here? Like, are you really going to fill a room with 1,000 pounds of mushrooms? Like, you know, and that kind of ties back to this quote that we started off with, this quote about, can you call pain pain, or is, and the act of making this piece just felt like pain, you know, like in moments of making this piece, it just felt like pain. And then it got canceled, and this room is just sitting in a warehouse somewhere, just dying by itself. And like, is that not just like, I mean, I think that there maybe is no other way that it could have happened. Not that I wish a pandemic, this pandemic has been a struggle for me in more ways than I can really begin to go into right now, but is one of the first times in my life where I have not been able to say, like, you know, pain, I got to make something beautiful out of my pain. This has just been a moment where I've had to be like, well, I have to draw boundaries with all of my friends, and I have to isolate myself to my house, and I'm immunocompromised, and I'm reminded of that every second of every day. And you know what? Like, I haven't made anything since I've been in quarantine, because all I've thought about is that right now pain doesn't feel like wisdom, it just feels like pain. And I so loved being able to go inside of it felt like I was inside of your apartment, if you know. And
now you are.
Yeah, now I'm like, but I don't know, be there with you while you were able to speak to and make from this place that felt like, I think, more vulnerable than I've ever really felt with your work, just because it felt like you were making, in my own way of interpreting your work, just felt like I was sitting with this that you were making from like this moment that I wish that I could articulate. And it's just everything you say in these essays, like I feel like I've thought them or felt them, but haven't known how to say.
Well, I wonder, I mean, there's so much that strikes me about what you just said. And I'm also, I know that there are a lot of people here, and I think people maybe have already started to put some questions in the chat, but if people have questions, I think we can turn to them soon. So go ahead and put them in the chat, and Lou will take a look at them. But one of many things that I was so struck by in what you said, Lauren, was, you know, when you were describing your vision for this installation in your crit back in December or January, that it seemed, you know, that it was sort of, it felt so improbable to people, or that there was this kind of disbelief or not quite seeing it. And I actually think it's so important to pause there, because both on a personal level, I relate to it, not because I've ever proposed anything as badass or awesome as involving 800 pounds of mushrooms in anything I've ever done, but because I think so often I struggle to say, sell magazines on my ideas as pitches, right? Like if I'm describing what an essay is going to be, I'm often met with like some skepticism from the editor, right? Like, well, yeah, I don't know if that's necessarily that relevant, or what's the hook, or I found over and over again, sometimes I just have to do it. Like I just have to make the thing, and then it'll speak to somebody or it won't. But I think it's worth believing in or following our guts or our hunches on, you know, the art that seems to be coming into focus in front of us, even if it's hard to explain or sell other people on in those early inchoate stages. And then I was also thinking, I think it's moving and powerful and, quite frankly, true, some of what you're saying about those moments when pain is just pain, and that it's an unrealistic fantasy, and quite frankly sometimes a toxic and tyrannical fantasy, to think that suffering can be instantaneously or automatically turned into art, that somehow suffering can be redeemed by its translation into art. I think often the process by which painful experiences become art is so much more long-term, complicated, and oblique than simply kind of you live the thing and then the next day you sit down and you make a beautiful installation or you make a beautiful essay. And, you know, every once in a while, you know, I think when I had COVID, which was, I should preface by saying, on the spectrum of ways one can have COVID, my case was not physically severe, and that's part of why this was possible. But I think I was in this kind of fever dream where I was quarantining in total isolation. We weren't leaving the apartment with my daughter, who's 2.5, and so we were on this planet of two. I was sick, and there was one night where I felt like almost as a process of survival, I wanted to try to write down some of what our days were like and some of what the bodily experience was like. I was especially thinking about the loss of taste and smell, which a number of people have experienced as part of their COVID illness, but was certainly a part of mine. But that felt like a kind of a bodily quarantine in a certain way. Like it was like yet another way the world was removed to like lose those senses. And that idea of thinking about various kinds of isolation, sort of social isolation, physical isolation, bodily or sensory isolation, made me think in a new way about some of the physical dimensions of your work, actually, because often you create sort of rooms within rooms, or you create sort of smaller, the mushroom womb, or I remember it was almost like phone booths with your scar installation where you would go inside and be kind of completely surrounded by these topographical photographs of somebody's scars and then hear their voice narrating the experience the scar had come from. And in a way, there's a kind of physical isolation involved in those constructions within the installations, but there's also a kind of radical communion where you're like getting close to some organic matter, or getting close to somebody else's voice, or getting close to somebody else's life. And so I wonder how you think about kind of isolation, how you think about isolation as a sort of emotional experience that you're trying to document in your art, if that is something you're trying to document, and then how you sort of create experiences of isolation or experiences of kind of immersion inside the physical installations you put together.
Yeah, I think for me, like isolation and immersion are kind of hand in hand in kind of all of the work. I mean, I think I'm really interested in this like overwhelming experience of being somewhere. It doesn't, like, for me in the mushroom space, like when you're watching the video back, you are alone, I guess, but imagine if that room was filled with people. Like, you would probably still feel isolated, but isolated in your own kind of thinking or being, but you would also be among other people. And the way that room was constructed was that there was 1 foot of space off the ground. So even when you were watching the films that were of a single story, you still saw the feet of everyone moving around inside this space that you didn't yet know. You didn't know what it held yet. Mm-hmm. And so I am really interested in isolation because that is something that I've felt my whole life, but I'm also really interested in like what this overwhelming, like the feeling of just being encompassed by something, whether that's like through isolation or just through like physically being in this space that is blocked off on all 4 sides. What does that make you think, and what does that bring to your experience of being with something?
I love that. And I think we'll turn to questions just in a moment. So I would really encourage people to go ahead and just type them in the chat, and Lou will pull them up, because we would love to hear what you're thinking about or wondering about, or what's emerging for all of you from Lauren's work and this conversation. But I was struck by one of the things you said, Lauren, about the initial design being one where you could sort of see people's feet in the mushroom room, that you could see that they were in a space and having an experience there, but not necessarily know what that experience was, which is sort of another version of that partial access, right? That you can understand something of what somebody's going through, whether it's an experience of pain or wonder, but you're also kind of reminded of the gap or reminded of the space between.
Yeah.
I mean, this is picking up on something that you were talking about the ways in which sometimes pain remains pain. But I wonder, if you think back to the kind of the whole arc of your artistic life, this most recent pandemic being part of it, but just the most recent installment, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between your experience of illness and your experience of making art. Like, what are those experiences like where something where you felt you had some kind of breakthrough around making art from the experience of illness, or the experience of illness somehow feeling illuminating or generative or opening onto something? And what were some of the experiences where actually the experience of illness felt like constraint, like it wasn't just this kind of fairy tale of making art from difficulty, it actually also felt just hard? I mean, I wonder if you could speak a little bit to that tension.
Yeah. I think that for me, the experience of making art and illness were always intertwined. Like I got sick and then found art kind of in the same moment. And so for me, it was always about channeling that pain into art. And I think that was something interesting that I was doing. I don't think I was consciously doing it. I was 15, but I think that may have been toxic in some way. Like I was always making art from a place of pain and nowhere else. I mean, maybe not nowhere else, but that was the primary mode. And until when the threat of the pandemic came in January, we were starting to hear about it. I stopped taking my medication because I was afraid that being on immunosuppressants would mean that taking immunosuppressants would mean that I was more compromised and therefore wouldn't be able to actually finish. And so I just had probably the worst arthritis I've ever had in my life, and was putting together this 800 to 1,000 pound room. Just working until my hands were bleeding and working until I was crying. I couldn't stop because I needed to do it, I was mentally and physically just in a state of panic and pain. And I think it was this moment where I was like, I need to evaluate or investigate what this relationship between art and pain is for me. And that's why I was kind of so struck by that quote. And I told you that I talked to my therapist about it for an hour, because I was just like, I need to deconstruct some of what I have been of how I direct my energy. And I think I'm still working through that right now. I mean, you sent me that quote 5 days ago, and it's completely rocked me. Just that you thought of that you recognized that you were there with that and with me. And I think I'm still working through this relationship.
Well, there are a couple of questions actually that have shown up in the chat that maybe I'll bundle together because they're related to each other and related to what you were just saying about this kind of ongoing reckoning. And one is from Madison Steiner, who I don't know, but maybe you do, who says, do you feel you have successfully confronted your pain, and how does it feel? And then Alyssa K says, did your exploration change your relationship with your disease?
I think that my relationship with my disease is changing every minute. You know, like I told you that I was recently diagnosed with this other disease that my dad had, and I spent like 4 years of doctors telling me I was crazy, like telling me that I was psychosomatic. And then I found out that I had a chronic thyroid disease that was causing my heart to beat like at 160 beats per minute. And like, it's been 6 weeks and I'm like my heart's resting at like 59 beats per minute, and I'm like exercising again. And like, it's constantly changing. It's constantly, I don't know, there's this constant like reinterpretation of what my illness means to me. And I think art does change that for me. It does force me to reinterpret. I'm just still trying to figure out the boundaries, or just how much I want to lean into art being the thing that processes the pain, and how much I need to do some processing of my own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that's I think it's so important to call out that kind of plurality, that like you know, unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's. You know, that like art isn't the same thing as therapy, and we go through certain reckonings in our friendships, we go through certain reckonings in our therapeutic relationships, we go through certain reckonings in our art, and all of those reckonings are talking to each other, but they're actually distinct too. There's a beautiful question that I think builds from some of that, and then some broader questions about isolation and illness. And
questions.
What?
Ask you some questions. I'm
well, no, but this is
hot seat right now.
I'll jump in. I know you're on the hot seat. I'll jump. This next one is for you, but the last two, I promise, are big, broad questions about isolation, and I'll jump into to save you from the hot seat. So this next one is from Tammy Rich. She says, "Thank you both so much. As a mom of a young man with chronic illness, it really makes me see his lifelong experiences through a very different lens." She says, "Lauren, can you speak to the dance or the dynamic of how illness, as your solitary experience or on your solitary journey, was affected by others, like family or friends, even clinicians, striving to make positive meaning of your pain or to put silver lining onto the bad for themselves?"
Yeah. I'll start this question by saying I feel so grateful every day. I have the best family, a mom who literally would not quit. I mean, she put everything into making sure, both of my parents, I've spoken a lot about my dad, so I just, but both of them, and my siblings and my partner and my friends, would do anything for me, and have not put up with, because I mean, I kind of have to put up with it, but they exist with me. Yeah, I've had so many positive experiences. I mean, connecting with people all the time about my illness, like I say now that I'm trying to reckon with thinking of pain as just pain, but I've had so many amazing conversations with other people who have chronic illness, with other people making art around chronic illness, with Leslie, who just, 5 years ago, I started just like, I didn't even really know the difference between empathy and sympathy, and was exploring that. I mean, the more I read, the more I'm present, the more I'm, something that I explore a lot is just like our inability to really express to doctors like the pain that we're in, and that's something that I'm really interested in exploring. But like, what is saying like I'm short of breath, or what is saying these things, like the doctor then interprets that as their own idea of what that means, and like language is so limited in our ability to kind of talk about these things. And so I've been trying to find creative ways to talk to my doctors, and but I feel lucky because I feel I stay as open as I possibly can. I stay vulnerable. I cry a whole lot. And I think just continuing to be honest with yourself and with the people around you, it's kind of freeing. And yeah, I don't really know if I answered that question.
No, I think I think even in the way that you were thinking out loud, I think there was so much truth. Yeah, and just honoring. I love that phrase used, existing with you. I think that probably is a better phrase than putting up with that they exist with you. Maybe we'll do. We're good. We're not going to be able to get to everything, and there's so many wonderful and thoughtful questions. I'm going to maybe do just two more. And there's one that's about your work, although I think it gets at something that we can both speak to. So this is from Eric Valley. I love the resonance of the two voices, your dad and you, who, as you note, in discussing shared and related yet unique experiences, come so close to actual co-identity, existing with, yet remain necessarily so far apart. Did you, and if so, how did you make conscious efforts? Did you intentionally employ specific techniques like the feet entering the room to universalize that experience of sought, realized, and missed connection? Or is the point that the connection is there anyway? So kind of how do you tie the particular to the universal, and what sorts of forms or structures do you use to communicate that experience of sort of seeking connection but also missing connection, that sort of simultaneous finding it and not quite finding it?
Yeah, I think just in throwing myself into, we talked a lot about the ordinary. I think just throwing myself into, like, just putting that conversation, like, pretty much unedited with my dad, or, you know, I don't know. I think a lot of it I just did. It's so hard to really, like, sometimes when I try and I see Alexa laughing, it's so funny because for like an hour and a half was just like, I don't know. Like, I actually don't know if I know. I could probably try and give an answer to that, but I think, like, so much of it for me has just been throwing myself into the ordinary, like the specificity of my story, and hoping that, like, people in the chat are saying, you know, I'm a parent of chronic, like, I didn't have to do that much because it's just what we're all living. We're living this. This is existence. And, like, I don't know, you talk so much about your relationship with your daughter. I'm so, like, struck by, Lou and I were talking earlier, and you say something about how you watch her, like, writing or something. You know, like that. I don't know. It's just like,
yeah. I think it's sometimes I when I'm with her, the only way I can write a little bit or scribble down a thought is if I give her own little pencil, you know, so she can do the same. So sometimes there are sort of accompanying little essay fragments have accompanying scribbles beside them that she has made. I mean, and I think, you know, I think it's really beautiful and important to honor the intuitive parts of practice too, that it's not always coming from a kind of top-down cerebral framework, even though there's clearly a lot of that thought going on as well. And I think, honestly, that was part of what really moved me about a lot of the home movies and this MoMA installation. You know, in a way, they're a sort of strange thing to end up at MoMA because they're ordinary movies, they're ordinary families, and they're not art with a capital A. But I think part of what they document are these, like, little glitches or these little moments of partial or missed or imperfect connection, sort of awkward moments where people are trying to figure out which way to go. Or there was a movie that I loved that had these two boys playing with a plastic dinosaur, and at one point they're trying to be very serious and put on this dramatic production, but one of them collapses into giggles, and that glitch is where the humanity rises up, like the moment where they're, like, not quite on the same page, or one boy, like, can't quite stick to the script. And so I think sort of that's part of why I'm drawn to some of the glitches in your installation, or the moments of where you know, I loved what you said about how you kept wanting to get a more perfect version of the conversation with your father, but actually this one feels just right, that it was on the phone, that there was something that it has that texture, that grit to it, and part of that grit is the imperfections in it, or the ways in which it's not seamless. Well, maybe we'll do one last question, which is a broader question, and people asked a few different versions of it, which is really around isolation. And it applies to everyone. One version of the question was from Addie Durr. What do you think are some of the ways of solving isolation that everyone feels in society, even during non-pandemic times? And Jean Walker asks, how would you encourage people dealing with the combined constraints of isolation and illness? But maybe that's a good way for us to close out. We can each just share, not that either one of us is going to solve the problem of isolation, but we could offer a few thoughts on that, and then just go home with all these things that we've been thinking and talking about. But I'm curious whether you've thought about combating isolation differently or in different ways through this pandemic, and what are the ways that help you sort of live inside that feeling, or fight it, or reckon with it, or whatever verb feels right, transcend it.
I mean, if I'm being completely honest, which I have an issue where I can't help but be totally.
I love it. I want that.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I feel super isolated right now. It's really a messed up time. Like, I am 27 years old, and the news is plastered with me being told, like, don't leave your house. People like you won't do well. And also like, we're going to go out there because, like, we have to live our lives, but you stay in your house. Like, that is not cool. And also really hard to deal with as anyone who's in any of these spaces of isolation. I think that I didn't really know the answer to this. I mean, I'm teaching and I'm working and I'm going to start making again. But you write in your essays about, like, the daily, and you talk about the daily, and I think I need to start refocusing my energy in my day, rather than in how scared I feel for what this looks like for me down the line. Isolation's real, and for people, in so many ways, people are feeling isolation right now, whether you live alone, or you can't go to work, or you're chronically ill, or you're being told that you have to stay home because you're older. Like, it's hard, but connect with me. I'm happy to talk to anybody. Connect with your friends, connect with your family. Like, I don't know, reality TV's fun. Read. I sit on my porch and just watch cars go by. Like, I don't know the answer to that, because I feel isolated myself, and I think everyone does. And I think that that's the moment, and that it's okay, and we just got to keep doing our best to stay connected. And I don't know. I don't have to.
First of all, I think a lot of the concrete things you said really resonate with me, but I also think it can be a very liberating thing to say, to sort of change the framework and say, maybe the project, especially right now, isn't to figure out ways to not feel isolated, but to kind of say, yeah, that is a big part of how it feels right now. I'm not gonna feel like it's a failure if I'm feeling this isolation, like it's part of the condition. So how can I maybe feel isolation, and rather than trying to get rid of the feeling of isolation entirely? And I'll just offer, like, some very small concrete things, because sometimes what helps me, one thing that I loved even before the pandemic, but have really been leaning into during it, are voice memos, which is a sometimes underused technology. But I was in a circle for a while where we were reading poems and sending them to each other as voice memos. I also I take walks often with my daughter, and we'll send voice memos to friends. And I'm surprised by how much more intimate it can feel to have a voice than an email or a text. And also, I sometimes exchange, and this really runs the risk of sounding like a Pollyanna, you know, just like insufferable practice, but it honestly helps me. I circulate gratitude lists sometimes with a group of people, and those are quite helpful as well. And I don't mean gratitude in abstract terms, like I'm grateful for my family, I'm grateful for my health, although I'm grateful for those things and they're important to be grateful for. I mean gratitude in a much more visceral, particular sense. I'm grateful for the prickly pears that I bought from a bodega the other day, and I had never eaten a prickly pear before. I'm grateful for the chocolate cake I had on my friend's stoop. I'm grateful for the way that my daughter pulls up her shirt and pushes her bare belly against the inner door of the freezer. Like these slivers of experience, like those are the kinds of things I think that we put on our gratitude list. And there's something about exchanging them too that makes it feel communal, makes it feel like it opens outward. Okay. I could talk to you for hours and hours and days and weeks and we will keep talking. And we'd love to, Lou can send along some of the questions we didn't get to. But thank you for doing this, and thank you to everybody who came, and thank you for Lou, to you. Thank you, Eliza. Thank you, Duke. Thank you, Duncan and Michaela, for putting this together 5 years ago. Yes. So many thank yous.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.